Hi, everyone. This is the slideshow for doing your rebuttal speeches for our first debates. Um, we covered all of the possible advantages and disadvantages in the last video, and I'm going to give you some ideas for some potential rebuttals to those advantages and disadvantages. However, you're free to rebuttal however you see fit based on the specific arguments that your opponents make, and you might think of some arguments that I didn't think of. So, in general, when you're rebuttaling, there's some things that you can question about their case, and I'll try to cover those here. I mean, first, you can always question like the sufficiency of their case. That is, did they really provide enough evidence to back up this case? Did they really prove, for instance, that digital media is the reason or the cause of these advantages or disadvantages? And a lot of times you might be able to say, no, that's the fault of people, or no, that's the fault of our culture, or that's the fault of capitalism, etc. So sufficiency is the question of how much evidence, and you can always question if they provided enough evidence. You can also question their sources. Did their source say what they claimed it said? Is their source credible? That is, does it have good qualifications? Do they have enough sources? Again, sufficiency to back up these arguments. You can also always argue that there are other causes or other actors to blame, as I kind of mentioned a second ago, capitalism, our culture, people, bad people, for instance, like there's the authoritarianism disadvantage, and maybe we should be blaming the authoritarians and not digital media. You can also always question their impact or their so what. You can say, hey, they didn't really tell us why this matters. And combining that with saying why your impacts matters can go a long ways, because oftentimes as a judge, you're going to be faced with two competing arguments and having to evaluate, well, this one's somewhat true and this one's also somewhat true. So which one matters more? So if you can argue that yours matters more than theirs, or that they didn't really prove how theirs matters, then that's something that you can argue generally as well. Like I said in the next bullet point, you can argue that your case has bigger impacts or is more important uh, than their case. In debate lingo, these are called no link. That is, if you don't prove the sufficiency that digital media is the cause, then there's no link to digital media, right? You can say non-unique. That is, that there are other causes or other actors that cause this problem, so it's not unique to digital media. You can say no impact. Again, they didn't prove why this matters. And the word outweigh, that's when you argue that your case has a bigger impact. So now on to the specifics. We have the networked publics advantage. And there are a lot of benefits to networks, as this advantage says. More information, more resources, more support. But networks can also create stress, right? We have to juggle a lot of people in these networks, and it takes a lot of time to be involved in them. And you think about the word like networking and how that can be stressful and time consuming. Um, Also, you could argue that that time networking would be spent or better spent face to face. That is, that sort of developing face to face or in person networks is better than developing them online. The argument about the Matthew effect, that is, that the rich get richer online, could be argued here. That, yeah, these networks are beneficial, but they're mostly beneficial to the people who already have a lot of privileges and benefits, and they don't benefit those people who need it the most. That kind of goes hand in hand with the digital divide arguments as well. And networks can create bad things too. We saw like the spread of COVID misinformation during COVID because of networks. Also, the spread of things like conspiracy theories these days might be another bad thing that networks can lead to. So you can maybe think of some other examples of that, but networks can also have their downsides. Networked individualism, very similar advantage, but this says that we both get the advantage of networks and the advantage of sort of remaining an individual and individualism. I think one thing here to really press is the impact. Why does individualism matter? Why are, networks important? Once again, it can be a time suck. So maybe it takes away from our time as an individual, our time as like solitude and just of rest and stuff like that. Networks can also create a lot of stress. I think the authors, Rainey and Wellman, in their book actually admit that the one of the downsides of this networked individualism is sort of the amount of time and effort and stress that comes with kind of managing these networks. You could argue that individualism is bad, that one of the problems in our society is that we're sort of too narcissistic and too selfish. And so individualism kind of undermines like our sense of ourselves as a collective, and that maybe collectivism is a better thing. That in fact that this individualism kind of trades off with community and collectivism. That we're all trying to like manage our profiles and make ourselves look good as individuals, when instead we could be, going to book clubs and building friendships and building community, for instance. As far as the community advantage goes, there are some arguments in our book, that talk about how it's more like pseudo community. Again, this idea that sort of the connections we make online aren't as deep and authentic as it would be kind of face to face. And again, there might be a trade off with spending time online versus spending time in kind of face to face communities and such. There are also negative communities, things like conspiracy theories, incel groups, white supremacist groups that people find community online through that can be harmful, or even something like gaming communities that are like toxic, maybe racist and sexist and stuff like that. These communities can be hierarchical and toxic oftentimes. And I think, another argument here is that there are alternative reasons that community is being undermined. Capitalism, individualism, just the stress and speed of our lives these days undermine community. As for the public sphere advantage, remember this is the advantage that says that digital media create these sort of like areas where the public comes together and discusses and debates politics. There are lots of answers to this in the book. Again, they're talking about these are sort of pseudo publics, and people don't really have that much commitment to them, etc. You can also always use your disadvantages to help answer these advantages, and I think this is a good example because of the authoritarianism and the slacktivism arguments can directly answer this, right? This argument is kind of saying it benefits democracy, it makes a better political system, and the authoritarianism and slacktivism arguments are saying the opposite of that, right? That it actually helps authoritarians, not democracy, and it actually kind of like demotivates people from being involved in politics. One of the answers in the book is that these are too capitalist because they're based on algorithms and companies like Facebook and Twitter that are making money off of them, that the issues that we end up debating are sort of the most sensational issues, and we don't end up getting to kind of like the more important issues or the root causes. If you look about like how much the news media covers climate change compared to like how big a problem climate change is, it's very minimal. And so it's likely online because people are uncomfortable talking about climate change. It doesn't make them feel good. It can stress us out and stuff. So the media doesn't cover it because it doesn't get as many clicks, right? They cover things that get more clicks, but the problem is that the things that get clicks maybe don't match up with what our big issues are. These public spheres are also too fragmented. If you think about the way that like your discussions on your page are different than the discussions your friends have on their page, or different discussions than your parents have, or different than discussions strangers have, right? So we're all not like talking about the same issues. There's this thing from the Wall Street Journal called Red Feed, Blue Feed that has like they created a Facebook profile for a conservative and a liberal, and you can look at them side by side, and you'll notice that like the issues that they're talking about are completely different, right? They're fragmented. So what advantage is there if we're not even talking about the same issues? One of the things about the public sphere is that it requires like what's called critical rational debate. That is that we're like, engaged in a debate, thinking critically about these issues and stuff. And really online, you don't see a lot of that, right? You see a lot of trolling and name calling and dismissiveness and stuff like that, which isn't very productive for a public sphere, right? Part of the public sphere idea is that we see ourselves as a public, right? That we see that we share interests in common. I don't really see more fragmentation online. This is often too passive as well. That is, a lot of people just kind of read the headlines, read the comments, but don't really engage in that critical, rational debate. So that might be a disadvantage. And we lack access because of the digital divide arguments. Um, and finally, I think one argument you can make is that, like, around the world, democracy seems to be backsliding. So if your argument's true, there should be more democracy, but really the evidence suggests that we're getting less democracy these days. For the activism advantage, obviously you can use your slacktivism arguments to rebut this, and those are probably the best arguments against it. But I think another argument here is that it creates opportunities for negative activism too. So things like white supremacist movements and the men's movement, which is a very sexist kind of movement or whatever, can gain traction as well and use these tools as well. Things like misinformation and conspiracy theories maybe can undermine this activism, as well as the arguments from the authoritarianism disadvantage that the government can like survey and crack down on activist movements by like tracking their social media and tracking their communications that way. Remember, the affirmative will have to prove that it benefits sort of like positive activism more than it benefits the authoritarians and the negative activism and stuff. So you can kind of press them on that. Have they provided sufficient evidence to prove that? For the citizen engagement and democracy advantage, it's also easier to manipulate citizens. Again, those arguments from the authoritarianism advantage here. When we have a bunch of citizen journalists and anybody can post a blog post, etc., then it becomes much harder for the public to determine the credibility of the news, and they're more likely to get manipulated by lies and propaganda and conspiracy theory, etc. I think this is one where you should really press them on the impact, right? Because I think a lot of people will end with, people are more engaged, there's more voting, there's more citizen journalism, and it's like, well, those things by themselves aren't really, there's not an impact to them, they're not really important. So what's the impact to that? Again, the digital divide can be used to blunt this, right? If a lot of people don't have access, then only a few, only privileged people gain this engagement. And again, the authoritarian government's argument. As for the digital divide disadvantage, how would you respond to that if you were the affirmative? I think you could say over time, this problem becomes less and less because more people get access to computers, more people get high-speed internet, etc. I think you can argue that it's still better than before, right? That before people didn't have access, and now more people do have the ability to voice their concerns and get involved, etc., than there was before. You can also question the impact, right? In a lot of ways, there's not much impact to this argument, right? Sure, some people don't have access, but that doesn't prove that it's a bad thing, right? It just proves that maybe not everybody gets the good thing. So what's the impact here? The reinforcing power disadvantage, this is the Matthew effect arguments, etc. Once again, I think you can argue that this is still better than before. More people have access, more people have a voice. Then, if you imagine like back in the 80s, there was only like 4 news stations pretty much. And now there's so many different news sources, etc. It does give opportunity for the little guy. And for social movements and whatnot, right? The people who didn't have a voice before can have a voice now. And it can challenge power in other ways. You can use your public sphere advantage, you can use your activism advantage to say, yeah, sure, in some ways, like the powerful get more power, but in other ways, it allows us to challenge power and to keep it in check and whatnot. You can also argue that this is the fault of users and not the media, right? That it's actually users who are all clicking on the same links from the most popular posts and stuff, and it's not, and it's their fault for doing that, and it's not, the fault of digital media. As for the political economy disadvantage, this is the idea that, the digital media creates monopolies and sort of exploits workers and stuff. There are lots of economic benefits to digital media. It's easier to start a hobby and sell things on Etsy. There's lots of jobs in the digital world, everything from like Uber to Lyft to Google to Apple, etc. Social media marketing is beneficial as well. 3D printers are going to save us money. Driverless cars are going to save us time and money. There are tons of economic benefits to digital media. I think you can also push back on the idea that this is exploitation because we get rewards for doing it, and exploitation is more, when you're kind of abused in your job and exploited in your job. But when we do things online, we get benefits. We get social interaction, we get community, sometimes we get money, etc. And here too, I think the impact argument is important. Why are monopolies bad? Why is exploitation bad? Right? Kind of press them on that. And I think you can argue alternative causes, right? That this is a flaw of capitalism and monopolies, and that if we pass different laws, we could take care of this problem. So this is not the fault of digital media. For the race, gender, and class disadvantage, once again, it's better than before. There's always been racial bias, there's always been gender bias, but things like the Me Too movement prove that digital media has given more people voices and has exposed some of these issues, and people are more aware of them than they were before. Exposure indeed is the best medicine. There's a lot of quotes out there that say, like, there's one that says sunlight is the best disinfectant, right? So you might think, like, I get online and I see racist people all the time, but there's an argument that, like, exposing that racism is good, right? People are coming around and supporting Black Lives Matter. People are taking a stance against racism. People are realizing that racism is still around, and that might be a good thing. I think you can argue that these sort of like racist and sexist trolls and stuff end up backfiring. That is, that they're so hateful that they hurt their own message and kind of isolate themselves more. And once again, right, this is a fault of society and not the media. The media is just reflecting the racism and sexism, etc., of our society and not causing those problems. As for the authoritarianism disadvantage, remember that we have the social movements and activism argument, so it helps democratic movements too, as well as the public sphere arguments, which are all about democracy. So even if you don't make those as your advantage, you can use those arguments as part of your rebuttal. There's a thing called the cute cat theory. Clay Shirky is the author for this, but if you type that in, I think you'll find it. And that says that basically, since the internet is used for both politics and things like cute cat videos or entertainment and stuff and such, that it's really hard for authoritarian governments to censor it, because when they censor, one thing, they end up accidentally censoring cute cat pictures, and that makes the public at large mad. So all these other advantages, the public sphere advantage, the citizen engagement advantage, the activism advantage, can all help answer these arguments. And again, who's at fault here? Is it really digital media that's at fault? Or should we be blaming the authoritarians and the oligarchs who are the ones doing the bad action in the first place? The slacktivism disadvantage, you might get the point at this point that you can obviously use your activism arguments to rebut this slacktivism disadvantage. There's arguments in the book as well as elsewhere in sources that say slacktivism still helps, right? That even if people are just like sharing an article or clicking like on something or changing their social media profile picture to like a Black Lives Matter flag or something, or the gay flag, the rainbow flag, that's still helpful, right? Again, that exposure thing, right? It gets the idea out there, and that's still helpful. Maybe you just give some money to a cause, that's still helpful, etc. And I think you can argue that this doesn't just aid slacktivism, it also aids real activists, right? People who are on the ground, people who are doing the organizing work, benefit from these tools too. So it increases slacktivism perhaps, but it also increases activism. And maybe even the people who are slacktivists were highly unlikely to be activists anyway, because they're not very motivated. All right, so that was pretty quick. I'm sure the video is a little long, but each of the arguments I didn't cover in a whole lot of detail. I was just kind of giving you the basics. Don't forget in your rebuttals to try to back up some of these arguments with sources as well, but you can use your own reasoning, kind of like I did here. to help you build your rebuttal. And importantly, at the end of your rebuttal, don't forget to spend at least 30 seconds or whatever, half a page to a page, rebuilding your case, reminding us of your case, and telling us importantly why your case matters more, why your impacts are more important, why community is more important than slacktivism, or why activism is more important than the digital divide, right? Or why helping authoritarian governments is worse than the public sphere or something like that, right? So tell us why your impact matters most, because you can often win or lose the debate based on that. All right, I hope you have a good rest of your week.